Usually doing hoods and fireplaces keeps plaster affordable so people can still enjoy it, but have it. If you're starting to do all your walls, you're looking into a multi-million-dollar house at that point, unless the client is, that's my number one thing I need in my house is plaster walls,
Right.
which does not happen. So when you're starting to do larger surfaces, those are going to be higher end homes. So this is where lime paint came around, is lime paint gives you the look of plaster at a much more affordable price point.
On today's episode, we had Jessica from Dolo Artisan Finishes on, and it was a great conversation. Learned so much about plaster. We start out the episode really talking about, running a business with your spouse, and their new business, only 1 year into business, but have a lifetime of experience as artists. And so it's always really fun to talk to artists about how they can create their passion into a business in their entrepreneurial journey. And then the rest of the podcast was really talking about plaster. So if you're interested in those two things, you're going to find a lot of takeaways from this episode. Without further ado, here's Jessica Matterson. Welcome to the Curious Builder Podcast. I'm Mark Williams, your host. Today, I am joined with Jessica Matterson from Dolo Artisan Finishes. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi, thank you.
I'm so excited to have you on because I, probably the last 5 years, have become obsessed and in love with plaster, which is great because you are a professional plaster artist.
That's what we do.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about Dolo and tell us about you and your husband's journey, and we'll just go from there.
Dolo has actually only been our name for about a year now. We actually rebranded.
I like it a lot, by the way. Your website is very fresh and very clean, and
thank you.
It's a great name.
I'm hoping by the time this rolls out that I will have, a lot more on it for people to see. But it used to be Alan Craig Custom Finishes, and that is a mouthful. And trying to get like a URL and emails, and people always get it wrong. And also when I was going to events, specifically wink events, people would be like, "Oh, you work for your husband." And it's not, jokingly, he would say he works for me. So it's one of those things where it came to a point where we thought the business had to represent both of us, since both of us were actually a big part of it. He is the main artisan. He comes with the years of experience doing these finishes. I come as more so the sales, the marketing, everything else that kind of comes in. And then on the side, I do jump in and pull plaster myself.
And I assume for business operations, then you're handling that as well, accounts receivable and payable and all the behind the scenes stuff.
It's a lot.
So you're doing all the business work, and he's doing
the fun stuff.
Okay. Analogous to a marriage.
So Dolo is what we came up with, and it's actually short for Dolomite.
I love it.
And Dolomite is a stone that is actually used in a lot of plasters. Many of them are lime based, but the thing about Dolo is, one, there are so many businesses that have stone or limestone in their name. We wanted to stand out differently. And two, Dolo just sounds more fun and it rolls off the tongue. It's easy to remember. And the thing about Dolo is it's actually harder than limestone.
Really?
Yeah.
How did you come up with, did you do like some naming exercises? Did you work with a brand specialist? How did you come up with it?
No, it was a week of writing in a notebook, and we were just writing down names. Like I was caught up in like Stone and Trowel, and then we were like, no, it sounds like a gardening company. So all of a sudden, Alan's, what about Dolomite? He's like, Dolo. And I'm like, genius.
As soon as you heard it, you know.
Yeah. So I come from a sports background, and he comes from an alternative sports background. And so for us, it sounded a little like surfy, skateboardy. So it's, well, that's fun. Let's run with it.
Have you guys been to the Dolomites in Italy?
No, I get asked that all the time.
I think you might have to take a trip there.
I know. I hope to actually, within the next year, to actually learn how to pull plaster from some of the experts over there.
Now, I'm not familiar, and I guess why don't we close out the branding stuff, because I think that's really interesting. And I can totally relate to you in terms of about 2 years ago, I went through a branding exercise right when I started the Curious Builder podcast. My other company is Mark D. Williams Custom Homes. So it's just not, it didn't need a semi truck to fit all those words on it. So I would love to have something simple and clever like Dolo. Plus I love the mountains. So Dolomite that's a great abbreviation. But anyway, so I can very much relate to the How do you identify it? How does it become a brand? And so many companies, especially construction companies and those associated with the fields, if you start younger, I started when I was 23. I don't know how old you guys were when you guys got started, but I never really thought about selling my company when I started it. And I very much regret naming it my own name for a number of reasons. And after 20 years, I feel like it's the cat's out of the bag there. I'm not sure I can really redo that, or I decided not to anyway. How old were you guys when you started this? And walk us a little bit through the business side of things, maybe before we get into the art of plaster, which I'm very curious about. But was Alan obviously practicing plaster before you guys got married? Walk us a little bit through I don't know where you came onto the scene and how that business formed. I always find it really interesting to hear, especially when you have husband and wife teams and how that works.
We're both classically trained artists. We met in college. We both have BFAs. Mine is more of a photo design background, where Alan's is actually a little bit more pointed toward the fine arts, like painting, sculpture. So he's someone that just loves working with his hands, and I'm someone that just loves thinking. I like to pre-think everything and then execute. So we're two very completely different artists, which actually is helpful in the field, because sometimes you need to just get in there and do it and work with what's on the job site. And then there's other times that we've had pieces that were commissioned were actually artwork, and it was many meetings and lots of sample boards. And that's more up my alley kind of thing.
Because you have to sort of think about it, design it ahead of time. You've got the client mindset around it.
Yep.
Interesting. How long have you guys had the business?
As Dolo, we've probably been just a year, and we're in our 40s. So we're tackling this just a little bit late. But before that, we were doing plaster for about 2 years here and there. Alan has always been doing plaster since he started. He started 15, 16, 17 years ago with a more prestigious artisan finishes firm in the cities, and decided to branch off from there. Had a non-compete that we honored out of respect and friendship for the person that owned the business. And within that time, we started a design build company.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
So you were building homes or remodeling?
Remodeling.
Okay. And mostly around the cities?
Yep.
Yep.
In the cities area, I found out that I have a huge passion for design, and that's how I come at our business too, is very visual but yet organized. Whereas Alan, on the other hand, it's all hands-on, as I mentioned before. And like when he gets in the flow, it's a true flow state is what I call it. And the trowel becomes like an extension of him, and he just starts making what we consider art.
That's really interesting. How did you know? I think it's really courageous, especially to start. And I think really whenever you start, running a business is really hard. Being an entrepreneur is really hard. What gave you the courage, both of you, to start the business? And how did you know it was what you wanted to do?
I think we just wanted to work for ourselves and have a more flexible schedule. And I come from a family of entrepreneurs. So for me, it's not new. I understand the struggles. I understand when we have no work and we get creative and we fill that time with either marketing or sometimes other things to bring a little bit of income in. So for me, it's learned. For him, he's learning as we go. But he just, as being very ADD, he doesn't really work well with solid times. It's one of those things where he just needs to move at his pace.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that obviously fits into the artist stereotype quite a bit as well. In that space, it's something actually I envy. As it's funny to hear that your husband, I always joke on the podcast that I have undiagnosed ADHD. And I very much think of artists as people that live in the moment. They turn off their phones. And same with, I think, dreamily of like architects and designers, that they would just have no just quiet Zen-like state. I know this is probably not true. I'm sure a lot of the architects out there are laughing right now. But I know sometimes you have to block off time for silence. And I'm actually reading a book right now called Pause. And it's just talking about the strength of a pause. And it could be, I often talk about checking out to check in. So some of these bigger things on the daily practices from the moment you get up, it's hard to find quiet time. It's hard to find that mental restorative place, which I can imagine as an artist, he probably finds it in his work. Is that accurate to say that when you've mentioned several times that he gets into this flow state, I think of running or writing and where you don't have distractions, that's often described as the
Yep.
flow state. Would that be accurate?
That is extremely accurate. He is someone that can tune in to what he's doing and get lost in it. Whereas for me, my brain is like yours. It's just like, go, go, go. What's the next thing? Maybe we should do this. Maybe we should try that. It's my brain goes too fast where I can't stop. I can't pause. I should read the book because I don't know how to pause. If I'm not moving, I feel like I'm wasting time. Whereas he, on the other hand, is definitely someone that embraces that moment and then just gets lost in it.
I just tell me if this resonates with you. This mental picture just came very clearly. I feel like, remember the Atari game Pong?
Yeah.
I feel like that my brain is the ball bouncing around all those bricks.
That is so accurate.
Right? We've just self-discovered what our emoji for our brain pattern is. I'm glad that Alan gets to be relaxed in his work. I hope when he listens to this, he'll just be in a Zen state. Let's talk a little bit about the business side of it, because husband and wives, obviously you have your marriage and your relation. Do you guys have children or no?
We have one.
Okay, you have one child. How
One
old?
teenager.
Teenager.
13.
Okay. Oh, 13 on top of it. Boy or girl?
Ellie,
Yep.
she actually helps me with video work on
Oh, great.
occasion for social media.
Okay.
She learned with a little device how to do the things that I actually learned working for a production studio. I find it interesting that she can edit just as good as I can.
Isn't that amazing? The root of my question is, how do you manage? I always ask this questions to husband and wives, but how do you manage the business and how do you manage the personal, like after hours, like around the dinner table? Are you a family that it's always on because you love it and because you enjoy talking about it? Or are you a family unit that has to basically shut it off so you have that mental space to breathe on the nights and weekends?
So that is a tough question because we're still navigating that.
Mhm.
And it changes. Like some days, if it's a hard day, if I'm working and then I have to go help burnish and then I have to come back and work. And then I get to a point where my brain just gets overloaded and it's okay, I have to detach today. And he might come home and be like, hey, what about this? What about that? And I'm like, I just can't absorb any more work right now. I need to just find something else to tune out for a while because my brain just gets so overloaded. Where there's other nights where it's like we're up till 9 o'clock talking about it and the passion of it and upcoming projects and what are we going to do here and what is something new we want to try. And it varies and it's tough.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% that it's even though my spouse isn't in it, because any entrepreneur's spouse is in it, whether they realize it or not. And whether you get energized by it or drained, it's a part of your life. And I think as you're communicating with your partner and your family, and there's a lot of highs too. Like I think it's really neat that your daughter she gets to witness this entrepreneurial spirit. She's watching you do what you both are doing, and it's informing her life too.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes as parents, I think, oh, when my kids get older, I'll invite them into the business. But honestly, I think even now I can do things, and it's mainly just sharing your life. That's all that your children really want to do. I have 3. Simon, the other day, he's 6. He was sick, and so he got to come with me to work today. That may have been his best. He said, Dad, this is one of the best days of my year. I was like, wow, okay, that was pretty easy. We went to job sites. He got to see the jobs, but it was actually really enjoyable for me too. And so I think sometimes as parents, we think that we have to shelter our kids from some of our work, but it's becoming clear to me that actually invite them in, even at a young age. They're very excited about it. Oh, of course, they think I'm chopped liver compared to the excavator. You take him to a job site and Troy, he's like this 6'5" excavator. And oh man, Troy's the best. So he let him sit on their lap one time and dig a hole. So there's not much I can do to combat that one.
I worked for my parents growing up, and I think it was a huge impact on my life on how I wanted to live mine. And I wasn't scared of being an entrepreneur. It does get scary when work is scarce. I know how to bounce back. And they got me started at, I think I was 10 or 11 years old. My parents are serial entrepreneurs. So it's like they had many different businesses, and I worked pretty much all of them. And even though I didn't take over the family business, everything I learned from them is what I have brought into starting my own business.
What were some of the businesses that they own?
First one was Dairy Queen. I started decorating cakes before I could be, old enough to wait on people.
Sounds like
So,
a kid's dream, by the way.
yeah.
It's like one for you, one for me.
Yeah,
One for
there you
me.
go. And it was art.
We have inventory issues. We're not
Yeah.
sure. Jessica really seems to be losing a lot of popsicle and bomb pops in the hot days.
Yeah. And then they had a paper supply company that had party added to it later on down in southeast Minnesota. And my dad he had an apartment that he rented out. He had, for a short period of time, a lawn care service.
So would he build them up and then sell them, or how did he?
No.
No. So he just shut them down, or?
Yeah. It just kind of fizzled out.
Yep.
Maybe that's where I get my ADHD from. For me, it was a great learning experience. And I wanted my daughter to grow up like I did. I don't want her to have the pressures of work, but I want to build a good work ethic in her so that when she's released into the world and decides to go off on her own, she can take over our business if she wants to, or she can do whatever she wants.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's fantastic. This episode is brought to you by Pella Northland. For 20 years, I've been using Pella windows, and I couldn't be happier to call them as a business partner, a trade partner, and someone that really supports us in our quality builds. We use wood windows and doors on every single one of our homes, and 98% of every home that I've ever built has been a Pella window. I've gotten to know their team here locally as well as nationally, and the way that they support us as a craftsman, as well as they support our homeowners with their lifelong guarantee, has actually been a game changer for me. So when people ask me who I use, I recommend Pella. If you want to hear more about Pella's story, you can listen to episode 1, where I interview Peter and Ed from Pella Northland about their journey into the Pella ownership. This episode is brought to you by Adaptive. For over 2 years now, I've been using Adaptive. It's an incredible game changer. It's AI technology based. It helps you with bill pay. And as a builder, there's very few things that anger our subs more than not being paid on time. Those days are gone. Not only do you know exactly where you are, but you can pay people through your ACH channels, making draws extremely quick. With one click of a button, which used to take hours, my office staff is now able to generate a draw to the bank or to the client in literally seconds. The thing that I appreciate the most about Adaptive is their ability to keep changing. We've given them 3 or 4 feedbacks on the things that we need as builders, and within just a few months, they're rolling those things out. This is saving us hours per week and days per month in terms of our efficiency. If you're looking to upgrade your business, I'd highly recommend Adaptive. You can reach out to them at adaptive.com or listen to the Curious Builder Podcast, episode 15 or episode 80, where we dive into their origin story. My parents both, my dad was a builder, mom was an interior designer. And as a child, you don't realize what you're absorbing and learning. You just think that's your life. And so you're either an adult or a parent looking back, you're like, wow, those are some pretty informative things that you learned. And I can share some of mine, but you mentioned that you learned a lot from your parents. What are a couple takeaways that you find yourself doing now in your business that you could trace back and think, oh, wow, that was an imprint on because of my parents, good or bad?
Work ethic. That is one. You just got to keep going. You just got to go and go. But then being an optimist and always knowing that the sun is just over the next mountain. You're going to see it. You're going to get there. Just hold on. And I think it's just that tenacity that I took from it. Also, something my parents didn't have a choice. Their business was almost like a 7-day a week. Some of their customers had opposite hours from when they worked, and they needed stuff on the fly. And something I've learned is my business doesn't have to be that way. I know that I need time off, and we take the weekends off. And if you were to send me an email, I'm not going to respond on the weekend.
Good for you.
It's Monday is where I pick it up again.
Isn't that funny? The turn of phrase, just want to call attention to it. You said we keep the weekends off. Mm-hmm. But that almost, there's an underlying comment or thought pattern or vibe through that comment that like you have to tell people like, oh, we take the weekends off. Like it would be expected that you should work, which is ridiculous. And I'm not saying the people, we've all worked weekends when we've had to. Heck, this weekend I have an open house on Saturday. So I'm not saying that you don't, but as a general rule, and I talk a lot about it, and it's taken me a long time. Frankly, it took until I got married as well to realize that the balance, and I think hopefully our spouses and those are in our family that love us and care for us can help us and ground us. Yeah. Because I do love what I do. It'd be easy excuse me, to work nights and weekends, but you're going to burn out like a Haley's Comet. That's not sustainable.
Yep.
And so understanding, I'm a huge, I talk about it all the time on the podcast, mainly just because I'm so passionate about it. I want it for other people too. And they have to make that choice for themselves, but I want them to know that our clients often can be very demanding, and that's okay to a certain degree. But I don't agree with this sentiment that the client is always right. I've never liked that saying, because I don't like anything about it. And so it doesn't mean that we don't really want to make our client happy. Anyone who's an entrepreneur, an artisan, I mean, literally you're an artisan. Of course you want people to love what you do. Of course you want to do a great job for them. Like, you go to the dentist, you don't go to the dentist at 9 o'clock at night on a Saturday. That's ridiculous. Nobody expects that. There's something about the construction field and all its operations, design and trade partners and subcontractor partners and vendors and all the people we work with, that there's this expectation that there's a 24/7 service center. That's not healthy. And it should not be. And it is something that I know a lot of others like me we talk about it a lot, because we want it to change. And I think it has changed. And I think we need to also be okay with walking away from work sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's hard to do that. Every entrepreneur, even though I know that sometimes you take a job, you're like, oh, I know this is going to challenge what I believe. And so it tests your mettle.
Yeah.
How have you found, the reason I applaud you so much is, even only 1 year into your business, there would be the temptation to just be like, got to work. I got to build. And I think I can tell you, in year 20, I still feel that way. Like, I don't know if that feeling really ever goes away. And I would love to get to a place where more just, you're more at peace. And I'm not saying it doesn't come in its waves, but I don't know, owning a business is, you're like a duck. Even if you're calm on the surface, your feet are swimming.
Kicking.
Yeah. It's not easy. Let's talk a little bit about Plaster, because
Okay.
I love Plaster, and I actually don't know very much about it. Maybe I'll just prime it with this. My favorite, maybe let's see here. 3 of my favorite homes that I've been into in the last decade, all the walls in the homes were plaster. There's one on Lake Minnetonka that was in the luxury home tour about 3-4 years ago. And then there was another home last year that was in Cottagewood that was incredible. And every single surface in the home was plaster. And it just, the way it feels, the way it calms, the way it reflects light. Tell me about that. Am I wrong that most people instinctively feel drawn to plaster? Why is that?
They are drawn to plaster. It has nuance. It's beautiful. It has texture. Try smelling it sometime.
Oh, really?
Like,
is it the lime or what's coming off?
It's the lime.
Okay.
Because plaster that is a misconception that people have. They think it's a faux finish, or they think it's like paint, and it's not. It's nothing. It would be more compared to like tile, like a giant tile that is hand applied by an artisan or a tradesperson, and you can't stop moving. You got to keep moving to get that flow, that we call it a signature. It's the way the trowel moves in a plasterer's hand, and everybody has a different signature. And you got to keep it going. If you have 2 people on a wall, you've got to keep it going. And then you got to swap, because you need that signature to intertwine.
Interesting.
And
so would it be analogous to like handwriting? Everyone's handwriting is so different.
In a way. And I've learned to pull the way Alan does, and it's exhausting. He does like really hard, short, fluid movements. And I really like these bigger, flowy movements. For when it comes to pulling plaster, he's the boss. And so I mimic what he does. But I see why he's tired at the end of the day when he comes home. And we just got done doing a giant barrel vault in a multi-family building, and I need a break. My shoulder needs a break.
So it's very physically intensive.
It's extremely physical. And that's something that's different than paint, because people don't see that pressure that we put behind the blade to compress the stone. And that's where the shininess comes from, the burnish. What you're doing is you're taking all those stone particles, those granulars, and you're smushing them together.
So that's when it gets really smooth. If you've ever touched plaster, sometimes it feels like a car finish. It's so smooth. That's from pressure.
Yes.
Okay.
And there's actually many, many different types of plasters. And there's many plaster companies that kind of make similar plasters or different plasters. And you have plasters that are going to have a high shine with maybe a lot of movement. You're going to have a plaster maybe that's more textural and actually looks like stone. It's all like the type of stone used, the granular size, that shiny stone, one of the ones we use, it's called Florenzia, and most of these are Italian plasters. They come from Italy. So that's one reason why our material is not necessarily priced like paint, because it comes over the sea and it's made by people over in Italy. The wrought stone is mined over in Italy. And
Is it like a paste? Like how is it? Maybe you get us in.
it's like a slurry.
Oh,
And usually if I have people come to our studio, I'll have them feel plaster. So like we have Tedelact, which is a water resistant plaster. It's, you put it in your hand and you can feel the different granular size. There's big, there's small. And then the Florenzia that I was talking about, it actually feels like toothpaste. The marble is so fine that you really even can't feel it, but its marble content is higher than most plasters. And that's where you can get that shine.
interesting. I saw a picture the other day and I had no idea you could do this. And I guess tile is porous. Like I'm thinking of like a shower.
Mm-hmm.
So we see traditional shower tile where you're doing your wall membranes, things
Mm-hmm.
like that. And then you'll put on your tile. But tile, a lot of tiles are not, they're porous, right? It goes through the grout, it hits the water membrane, comes down and drains. So it's essentially it's a visual water protected. It's not waterproof.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that you can do a plaster shower.
Yes, it is very much tile. It actually does have small pores and small cracks that airflow can flow through. And of course, when it comes to a shower or something like that, your waterproofing comes with the membrane. It doesn't come with
Right.
the top material. And that is a misconception when we're doing plasters in bathrooms. But the beautiful thing about plaster, and this is getting into the health benefits of plaster, which are so vast, but plaster is breathable and it actually pulls carbon dioxide out of the air in order to cure.
Really?
So it's pulling like what
Is
we
that
breathe
is that
out.
continuously, or once it cures, it's done?
Nope, continuously.
Continuously. So
They're breathing walls.
really?
Air does pass through plaster.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, because they're tiny little micro cracks.
Interesting. I mean, like a tree obviously continues to
Yeah.
breathe, but it's a live thing.
Yeah.
How could a dead thing like stone, how could it keep on breathing? Let's say I own a home for 10, 15 years or 20 years or 100 years. You're saying that entire time that it's breathing, taking carbon dioxide out?
The lime. And it also is a humidity buffering. It will pull moisture out of the air when it's hot and humid. And when we get into a dry season, it releases that moisture back into
Oh
your
my.
space. And people don't understand it. Like paint
I've
doesn't
never
do
heard
that.
that.
Plastic paint doesn't do that. It's meant to seal off all that. And with plaster, it's recommended for people that have breathing issues or asthma because of that process of pulling the carbon dioxide out of the air.
That's fascinating. Now I just made a note. I am going to do a plaster shower in my model home because now I want to try it out.
Keep in mind, all plasters are not water resistant.
Right.
And even if you throw a concrete sealer or something on there, they're not. You have to have a specific plaster like Tedelact that goes into wet environments. And Tedelact has been used for centuries over in Morocco in bathhouses and homes.
So it would obviously hold up really well if it's breathing. So let's go through the shower example. So what would be the maintenance, or how would it be different than, let's say, large format tile in a shower? Or it's no different?
It's really no different. It's just one giant tile.
I like the fact that there's no seams, and that's really seamless. I'm thinking of shower niche, how it would fold in with no seams or the grout lines would be phenomenal looking.
But think of it as one giant tile. It still needs to have that silicone bead at the bottom, like between the floor and the wall. You have to treat it as such.
Is that because is it flexible? Because if, let's say your house settles, will plaster crack?
If your substrate cracks. So this is where we get into the substrate. And when we start doing Tedelact, like in a bathroom, I meet with the contractor and I explain how the substrate has to be, because if it's not done right, it will crack.
So give me an example. So let's say we're going to do this in my shower. So we've got it framed up. Are you putting on like a Durarock or something like that? Hardy backer. Okay.
It doesn't flex. Durarock does. It won't crack. So it's hardier, and because it won't crack, it won't make the plaster crack.
Okay.
So that's the ideal substrate. And then you have to red guard it. That's
Yeah.
your
And that's the
waterproofing
waterproofing,
membrane.
which we would do.
Yep. And then we come in after that and start applying.
Are you doing the floor as well, or is the floor usually a tile?
We recommend Tadillac not be on the floor.
Slippery or?
No, it's not meant to hold water. It's meant to repel water.
Gotcha.
So you can use it on the walls, but you want to use tile on the floor.
Oh.
If we're going that way, you'd want to start going into micro cements. So because those are more chemically made.
Mm.
So they have binders and they have resins that are supposed to keep the water from penetrating it.
Interesting.
Whereas Tadillac is natural. And most plasters that come from Europe have to meet certain standards. And with Italian plasters, they can only be at the most 3% synthetic. So when you're getting plaster, it's a natural material.
Why do we not have the rights? And I know a lot of our materials come from overseas, thinking obviously the marbles and the stones, but like you're cutting it and it's open and that slab of marble is wherever we're getting it from. The stone that we're getting, do we not have those stones in the United States?
For Tadillac and things like that, you have to be a really good chemist to know how to make plaster. But we actually use some lime paints and lime washes that the stone comes from the Great Lakes region. It's made in Canada and it just comes over the border.
What do you mean by you have to be a good chemist?
This is going into an area I'm not so great at right now.
Yeah, that's okay. We can
say
high
chemistry.
Level. Yeah.
I think I got an F in chemistry.
I didn't do great in chemistry either.
It's just knowing like the formula that you need to be able to make plaster.
Is that something that Alan has to do in the field, or is it coming that way?
We purchase all our plasters from the Plaster Center, a local store, and we use what is available to us. There could be a fail rate with plaster if you were to make it yourself. Some people out there do, and usually that's more of the faux finish. They're adding like synthetics to it. If plaster isn't made right, it delaminates, it cracks, it falls apart. Lime washes, we call it releasing. So if you put the lime wash on the wall and you run your hand over it before you seal it, and your hand is the color of the wall, like it's pulling the pigment off the wall, the chemistry is not right in that plaster.
Interesting.
Or lime.
You had just only because you've said pull many times, you mentioned even like when Alan is pulling plaster, why is it referred to as that? I mean, you're pulling the stone across the wall. Is that why it's called pulling?
We use blades, and there's specific blades. And most of the blades that we use actually all do come from Europe. And they're not cheap. They're not drywall blades. They're not gypsum blades. They're specific, really sharp blades that are intentionally made for our craft. And they will cut you. Like, it's common to get cut by your blade because they're that sharp.
Interesting. I suppose as the blade is coming off and releasing, that edge has to be, they're defining the edge for a specific. How many knives would Alan be working with if he's working on a wall exactly? Is that what they call them, knives?
We just blades? Call them blades or trowels. 2 to 3, depending on what finish he's doing. We just finished one of those beautiful kind of like clay coat plasters on a barrel vault. And we're both on this tiny little lift at the baker. And he's going between 2 blades at the time. And he has a bigger blade and then a smaller blade. And the smaller blade is for the burnishing, where the bigger blade is for the application of the plaster. And when we're up there together, like it can be, he has a flip of the wrist. And it's really cool to watch him pull plaster because he'll just pull plaster and all of a sudden he flips the trowel and then he keeps pulling. When you're working that close to him, though, you just want to make sure your face like stays away when that blade is coming and flipping because it would cut you.
Wow. Take a higher step back a little bit. Who usually, I love plaster. I've been building for 20 years and it's only been the last 5-6 years that I usually get like a fireplace with some plaster or the hood. And that's about it. Why? Talk to us a little bit about who's usually the decision maker in bringing plaster into a job. Is it the client, the designer, the architect, the builder? Or just start with that.
Mainly the designer.
Usually the designer.
Yep. And that's why I go to networking events and it's easy for me to relate to designers because I have a design background as well. And I form these relationships with designers and then I educate. I love pulling in designers and everybody into our studio. And sometimes we even do demos and we'll explain this is how it's done. And it's really interesting to see people be like, oh, wow. And it's the designers mainly. Sometimes the architects or the builders will spec it, but usually it's the designers who I communicate with.
Mm-hmm. From a out east, I've got a friend, Nick Schiffer with NS Builders, and they're in Boston. And so I don't know if it's just because it's older out there, but it seems like it makes it sound like he doesn't do a ton of sheetrock. They do a lot of plaster.
Yep.
On the East Coast. And in the Midwest, it's primarily dominated by gypsum board or drywall.
Yep.
Any comments on why that is or thoughts?
It's better for you. It's more sustainable.
No, I know that. Why is the areas so like, why are we so predominantly drywall? It's better. It's more beautiful. I mean, is the cost that much more? We'll talk a little bit about cost, but is the East Coast just have more older homes had plaster? So more people are used to keeping plaster in even the new homes.
It would be that because they want to keep the design consistent through the whole home, which we have been pulled in here to do plaster walls. But it's a trend. It's just a trend. And here, drywall is what people know. So drywall is what people use. It's just people don't know that plaster is an option.
Agreed. It's an educational gap.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Obviously, the podcast right now is hopefully educating people to try out plaster. What do you think the barriers of entry are? Is it simply education? Like when you go to these events, and I think we met maybe at one of my Curious Builder events the first time. Did you come to one of our live events last year or no? I think you came to the Welch one, didn't you? The one at the wedding venue in St. Paul?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was the first one.
Because you have some killer shoes. And I think every time I see you, I'm like, oh, you have some rocking shoes. And you've got some really cool cowhide. We'll have to get a picture and put it on when we air this one because you always have the greatest shoes. Anyway, I digress. My point is like, how are you finding designers reacting when you're meeting? I assume business development is a big part of your job. You're calling on designers, you're bringing samples to their showroom, or walk us a little bit how designers are receiving you and how that process is going.
90%, it's great. They love what they see. They now understand what it is and why it has a higher price point than, say, any other surface treatment. I have one designer that I just educated her about it in the last month, and now she wants to use it everywhere. And I'm just like, let's do it. Let's bring it into our market. People need to start seeing it here. And it's hard because plaster gets the stereotype of the really bad Tuscan kitchen. And plaster has come so far since then. And that was just a trend. So that's why it looks that way. Plaster can be old world, plaster can be new and modern, plaster can be smooth and reflective, and plaster can be a texture. It all depends on what plaster you're using and what the stone content is of the plaster. There's no boundaries, especially if you're working with someone that's an artisan like us. Like, we creatively problem solve. Like, if we haven't done it, it doesn't mean we can't do it. If you come to us and this is your vision, this is what you want to do, we're like, we're going to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Where are the most common places that you see plasters as a starting point? I think I'll just use myself for an example. Hood, it would be a common one, I would imagine, and fireplaces.
Yep.
What other surfaces do you see that is probably the next hurdle? If someone was going to get, let's say I'm here, and for those not watching, no plaster, to the right side here, which would be everything is plaster. Mm-hmm. What is the evolution of how you've seen people make their decision? What are some of the stepping stones? What's my next stepping stone?
It is a price point. Mm-hmm. So usually doing hoods and fireplaces keeps plaster affordable so people can still enjoy it, but have it. If you're starting to do all your walls, you're looking into a multi-million-dollar house at that point, unless the client is, that's my number one thing I need in my house is plaster walls, right, which does not happen. So when you're starting to do larger surfaces, those are going to be higher end homes because those are the people that are willing to pay. So this is where like lime paint came around. Is lime paint gives you the look of plaster at a much more affordable price point. But that is actually a faux finish. It is trying to look and be like plaster, but it does not have the durability of plaster. As I said, plaster is stone. So once it fully cures, which it's fully dry in 24 hours, but it takes 6 months to fully cure. It is stone. That wall is going to be around for 100 years. Whereas like your drywall, even if you lime paint it, it's going to get scuffed. It's going to get gouged. You're going to have to repair it, replace it, paint over it.
Now, just thinking of my 3 little kids, I assume plaster, obviously, I would imagine would clean stone. So if you get it smudged up, drywall, paint touch-ups, I assume you don't have to deal with that with plaster walls, correct?
There are touch-up. If you take a hammer to it, just if you take a hammer to tile, it
I'm
will
not thinking
break.
of tile. I'm thinking of fingerprints or.
We seal the plaster.
Okay. Yeah.
So it depends what sealant we use for what plaster we're using. Because limestone is porous, it will take on moisture. Something that we've run into though is if we do a bathroom in plaster and we seal it and it gets wet, you're going to see the tiny little micro cracks, and you're going to see it's going to pull in that moisture, but when it dries, it all goes away.
Interesting.
That's the beauty of the sealer.
It's like a living finish. It's meant to patina. Is that accurate? Yep. It's going to move. I mean,
Cadillac, if you seal it with the traditional soap sealer, it is meant to patina. For the American market, people don't like that patina as much. So we end up sealing it with like a cement sealer instead. That's going to keep it a little bit more clean and crisp looking.
I think one thing that if you're a builder thinking about, or a remodeler thinking about doing more plaster, you're also going to get the credit on the painting, because now you don't have to paint. I guess the question would be, if you're doing, let's say you're doing base, let's say you do a 6-inch base, and let's say you enamel it. So you're enameling the base, and then would the plaster go on second, or would it go on first?
It can go either way.
Okay.
If the base is put on, like if the finisher has put the base on, but maybe it's not painted yet, we prefer to come in after the painters, because it's a lot easier to get plaster off paint than it is to get paint off plaster.
Yeah, interesting. Good to know. Well, interesting. How you would typically apply plaster to a sheetrock wall? I think because out in Boston, they don't use a lot of drywall, from what I understand. What would be their backer boards that you're applying your plaster to?
We can apply it directly to drywall.
Okay.
Yep.
So you would save money on taping then and finishing.
No, you still need to tape, because the drywall, when it shifts, which it all shifts,
oh yeah,
it's still going to, if it doesn't have that tape there, it's still going to crack. So that tape is like your Band-Aid that kind of keeps
it.
So if the tape job is bad and the plaster cracks, or if they didn't tape at all, which we have run into before, it's going to crack. And if we come back in and do it, we're going to do it almost similar to what the drywaller would have done.
So you do need to tape it. So you're not really saving any money. Is there another substrate that you would plaster over? It sounds like you can plaster over anything. I think I've had you guys plaster over wood before. Yeah. You can plaster over any solid surface.
It just has to be primed with a mineral-based primer,
so it sticks.
Yep. Because otherwise that wood or drywall, it will pull the moisture out of the stone too fast, and then you get cracking that way as well.
Plastering's been around a long time. Before drywall even existed, what did they plaster to? Lath.
What was lath? But that's a different type of plaster.
Yeah.
And that's another misconception that we have, is people think we're that type of plaster, and that's a gypsum-based plaster. Our plaster is more on the fine finishing end. It's what, like in Europe, when they plaster, they're plastering on stone over there. So if like it's a poured concrete or something like that, they're plastering directly on stone. It's the American market that plasters on drywall.
Interesting.
Yep. Wow. And so that's a nice thing for us, is since we have that build background, we can come in, pre-inspect the wall and say, this needs to be fixed, that needs to be fixed. See that crack in the drywall? If it's an actual fissure, like that needs to be taped and mudded.
That would be super helpful. Having remodeled now, I can see why that would be so helpful from a selling standpoint, because you're making, as the builder, you're making me look better, not only to the client, but also to my warranty and to your own product, by saying, Mark, this bathroom or this wall is not going to work because we're going to have issues with it.
Yeah.
But now that was that experience that you got while you were remodeling. Do you still do some remodeling as well, or no?
Not really.
Okay.
I may design on the side, maybe a project or two a year. But right now, this business is keeping me on my toes.
Yeah. Sounds like it. Do you have multiple people? How big is the company, or is it just you and Alan?
It's just Alan and I.
And how do you regulate what Alan can do and jobs that you have in queue? How are you finding basically balancing the business that you do have and regulating the timing with whatever jobs Alan is on to the next person in queue?
We've learned through doing, just in the beginning, it was easy for me to do pretty much everything. when talking to a client. But now it's gotten to the point where I'm stretched more thin. We have a lot more projects going on. So if a repair comes in, I directly go to Alan, because as much as I know the chemistry, or not the chemistry, let's take that back. As much as I know Plaster, he has a better idea of how to fix it. So he can actually go in and color match and match the material and the texture and make it look like it never even was there.
Does that happen a lot? So if you were to hang pictures, you're puncturing a hole through
Your plaster.
your plaster. You just gave me an eye roll that says, don't do that. So how would you hang art? Does that come down from an art rack, from the ceiling, or how are we putting things on the wall?
You can put things on the wall the same way you put a picture, except for you want to use a masonry bit to drill into the wall. You never want to hammer a nail because the plaster is going to chip.
Yep.
If you want to pay the plaster to come back out and fill the holes and make it so they were never there, so you can put art in different places, then that's a budget thing.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, just keep your art in the same
same
area.
Location. Make sure you
hiding all the holes.
Yeah, make sure that keep going up, don't go down.
Yeah, but no, they're all repairable.
Yep. Nope. That was one of my questions. Even in drywall, the thing that I like about plaster is that it reflects light irregular. So I wonder, does that actually help you or hurt you with clients? We build so many homes with a lot of glass exposure and southern exposure. We get all this natural light, and the human eye is incredible. You can look at a flat level 5 drywall finish, and you can spot even the best framer and the best floating job. You can still see little undulations, right? Does plaster help with that because it's expected that you're going to have variability, or does that not actually?
No, and this is why I come in and inspect like at least once before we start, because nail pops will be seen. Any imperfection in the wall is just going to be heightened with the plaster.
So nail pops will go through plaster.
Oh yes.
Oh, bummer.
Plaster is not a filler. That's another misconception we have, is we can't fill cracks. We can't level out a nail pop.
So those little bulges, or like the little.
Yep.
Yeah.
Plaster is actually, this is where the name micro cement comes from, because it's micro fine, paper thin layers of veneer. That is what plaster is.
Yep. Yeah. So any imperfections underneath will just translate above.
And we need anywhere, if it's a textured plaster, level 4. If it's like a high polished Venetian, definitely a level 5.
So how does that work then? So even on the walls, you need a level 5 too then?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. I can see why this gets more and more expensive. Unfortunately, how homes move all the time. We come back in Minnesota, we have to warranty our homes for 10 years. 1 year, we come back for a craftsmanship, nail pop, tape cracking, things like that, or letting loose. What happens when you have the substrate below is not performing? So do you have to basically do microsurgery? You've got to open up your plaster, get back, fix whatever the nail pops are, and then replaster and blend it in.
Yep. So it comes back to whoever built the wall.
But a house settles. That's not really anybody's fault.
Yeah, that is something that people have to understand. The thing is, there's a fix. We can still come in and
you can still blend it. That's the main thing, is that you can blend it. I mean, they do it in drywall all the time. The problem sometimes with drywall, especially in a level 5 finishes, let's say you have a big great room and kitchen with no beams. I mean, it might span 30, 40 feet. And usually the luster of the new paint. So you might fix that drywall crack, you might paint it. And it's not as simple as just, even though we do flat paint a lot on the ceilings, you oftentimes have to repaint the entire ceiling because your eye is so good at picturing out the slight texture of the nap of the roller or the sprayer or whatever. How does that translate? Let's say you had some cracking in plaster. Would you have to float out the whole wall to make it match or not?
So it depends. It depends how bad the crack is. If it's like a tiny little crack, yeah, we do have to go beyond the crack and feather in the material. And this is where you see the expertise of somebody that does it. This is not an area where you want to skimp and just have somebody else say, hey, look at this plaster. Can you fix it? And it's like, I don't really know what plaster is, but okay. I've seen that and it doesn't look great. But yeah, it's the blending of the material back in. Sometimes if it's sealed with a wax, which is Cera wax, is a material that we use to seal frequently. We do sometimes have to sand that back because it's protective layer. And then we have to fix the crack, feather it out, and then re-wax over
For
it.
those that are remodelers or builders out there that are listening that want to do plaster in their warranty line item, should they be carrying some sort of dollar amount forward to cover their 1 year callbacks, knowing that they'll have it? Like on drywall, for instance, let's just say on a new home, let's say it's a 4,000, 5,000 square foot house. Maybe our drywall bill is, I don't know, 28 to 30,000. I'll probably keep a $3,000 allowance that's miscellaneous
Mm-hmm.
just to cover dings and cracks and whatnot.
Yeah.
And then I'll have a warranty line item that just covers all kinds of things at the end of 1 year. Is that enough, or should I be having a dedicated line item for plaster repairs after 1 year of settling?
It does depend on the type of plaster. If it's Tadilac or something like that, yeah, I would recommend maybe having an extra cush on that. If it's just something more simple, like a very flat, more merino, not so much.
Okay.
And it depends where you put it. If you're putting it on a stone base or hardy backer, then no, you're
You're
probably
not
not
going to
going
have
to
an
get any
issue.
cracking at
Right.
all.
Right.
But if you're putting it on drywall and it's a whole wall or a
Right.
whole room and a ceiling, that's something you might want to budget for.
Yeah. I think just talk to your local artisan plaster individual and see what they recommend. Very interesting. Do you feel, you're an artist, do you feel like you get to scratch your creative itch? It feels like Alan gets to, obviously he gets sore shoulders, but he's in his flow state. How do you recharge your creative sense, or do you find enough creative freedom in what you're doing to, it feels like you're doing a lot of the operations? How are you, you're an artist, how do you scratch that itch?
Sometimes if it's a bigger job, I'll come in and it's fun. I hate straight painting. I love plaster.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just going from a brush to a blade. It's just the moving of the material, the sound it makes. It's just so much more satisfying. But you have to know what you're doing because you're at the mercy of the dry time. And through that, I have found enjoyment, and I actually make art on the side with leftover plaster when I have time.
Yeah.
But in that way, I get to learn the material even more of what not to do with it and what to do with it. But that is how I come in and sometimes get to do fun artistic things. Sometimes if we're doing a marble wall or something that even has more character, that's when I might come in too. Again, Alan and I are different artists. Our lines are different. We did the beautiful plaster marble wall at Maison Margot. And it was one of those things where as we were in the preliminary meetings deciding what it was going to look like, the chef kept liking my movement better. And it's one of those things where that wall is actually beautiful, like piece of artwork that my husband and I actually did together, because it has his sharp lines and it has my curvy like veining in it as well. And that is the first project I ever touched. And I felt so much more worth
Mm-hmm.
when I was in the field, and not on a day-to-day basis because my shoulder couldn't keep up with it. I couldn't keep up with the physicality of the job. But it is fun to step in on occasion and pull the plaster and do the more artistic veining when it's a marble finish. And by actually learning how to pull the material, it helps me better with how to advise on the substrate and how to sell the material. And for me, it just opens up the material more to me. I am a great salesperson for things that I love and that I'm passionate about. I couldn't sell you something I didn't like.
I completely agree. Yeah, when it's first person and when you're passionate about it, it comes out in your pores. What do you see as the future, the next year to 3 years? What is your hopes for the business?
Just always being booked, but maybe enough time to do like art on the side would be ideal. We love to travel. Hopefully, we have some cabins up north that we can travel to. Or we did one travel job this year down in Florida where we did a hood and a ceiling. We do love to travel. And also doing new finishes. Like we want people that come to us for what we've done, and we can do anything that you see on Pinterest and what's on social media, but we love the challenge of a designer coming to us and being like, here's this wallpaper sample. Can you make something that looks like this? And we'll be like, yeah, we can. And then that way you don't have seams and it's durable and it's beautiful and it's healthy and it's humidity buffering, and it just there's so many pluses to using plaster.
I think the health side of it is really intriguing to me.
Yep.
And especially as we talk more about what we breathe. We had someone on the podcast not too long ago, Jonathan Kramer from Eversphere, and he just made a comment that has still been rocking my world, that 90% of our time is spent indoors. And I'm just blown away at that number. And I mean, between sleeping and the office and those types of things, we talk about what we eat. We talk a lot about exercise. There's not a lot of conversations about what we breathe. I've been marvel at our lungs, what our lungs can process. I do think that being that we're in the home building business and there's a lot of technology innovations and things like that, we're becoming more and more mindful, especially where we were 10, 15 years ago. VOCs and paints and formaldehydes and off gassing. And we're still have a long ways to go, but at least the conversations are happening. And so I think it's interesting how some of these old forms like plaster turns out they're a lot healthier for us.
Yep.
And so going back to some of those older things, which is really interesting to me.
Even if you want to invest in lime paint, it's so much better than an acrylic like latex.
How you mentioned that it doesn't last as long. Walk me through that. What's going to happen to it exactly?
It will it has the same kind of it's going to be just like a painted wall. If you bump up against it, get draws on it. We do seal it, especially if you have an environment that has kids, or if you put plaster in a bathroom minus the wet area, we still recommend sealing it. And that sealant is what protects it. But sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Brain ADHD.
Yeah.
It's there and then it's gone. It's more affordable, but it doesn't last as long. And that's the thing about plaster is stone, lime paint, lime wash, they're still lime, but they don't cure hard like plaster does.
I mean, just most people would probably repaint their walls probably every 10 to 15 years. Yeah. Is that similar lifespan of lime paint?
Yeah.
Yeah. Something like that. Okay, so nothing too different, but now I'm really curious about it to see do you guys do lime painting as well?
We do.
Yeah. Okay.
Alan he prefers doing the higher end finishes, and that is what's really good at. Personally, since I'm more like entry level sometimes, I actually love lime paint and lime wash.
Sure.
It's fun. It's easier. It doesn't hurt your shoulder as much.
Yeah. So let's say you were to get a 4,000 or 5,000 square foot house and someone was to say, hey, I want all the walls done. I've heard of other times where you work with other artisans I have a plaster individual that I use, and he's a lone wolf operation. Yeah. If you and Alan were to do one house that's that big, how long would that take? And would you do it solo, or would you bring in other artisans to help? Like how much time, like from a time standpoint, like traditionally, let's take away the enameling of all the cabinetry. So let's say it's going to take 2 to 3 weeks to enamel all the trim, paint all the walls, all that stuff. We still have to paint a lot of the wood surfaces, but how much time could somebody budget or expect to do plaster on all the walls?
So a hood is 2 to 3 days, depending on the complexity and the nuance of the plaster. Fireplace, about a week, can end up being 6 days. Alan is a bit of a perfectionist, and he will, if he needs to put more time into his finish, he will at no extra cost. We want it to be perfect. If we were to do a full room, that might be more like 2 weeks. Maybe if there's 2 of us, it might be a week and a half. If we were to be doing a whole house, there's a community of plasters, and I have people I know what their strong suits are in this community, and I can pull them in. If
that was what I gathered from this other individual as well. They were working on a huge house, and part of it was the house was, beyond normal in terms of size, and so it sounded like there was a number of different plaster artists working together. I was curious, to your point, overseeing it, or like a point person, because everyone has a different signature or flow rate. That would be, and maybe I would imagine that you and your other contemporary artists would probably recognize it maybe easier than I would, not knowing what I'm looking at. Would that be correct?
Yes. And that's something that Alan has a past in. He actually was a head plaster and a crew lead for the plaster company he worked for years ago. He worked with them for 8 years, and his job was to step back, look at the wall and rotate the plasters.
Sure.
If he noticed that the finish was starting to look off and signatures were very different.
Yep.
And I tell that to people when, even with lime wash, rotate. If
Yep.
it's 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, you have to rotate.
Yep.
Because that way it's going to look like one giant finish versus, okay, it's cloudy over there, but it's Xy over here.
Mm-hmm.
It's,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Yeah. As we wind down here, maybe just on a personal note, what you mentioned, you like to travel for pleasure. What are some other business models that you either really enjoy or like to further your own businesses? Do you like to read? Are you a podcast listener? How do you get ideas for how you and Alan should create your business?
I love listening to podcasts, yours included, which I've actually learned a lot for our business because I take bits and pieces out of every episode. I get inspiration by seeing. I look through a lot of magazines. I love Pinterest. I think it's amazing for ideas. Instagram is something that I love being on because it always feeds me what I'm looking at and what I'm doing and what plasters are doing in Europe. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, but what if I did this with that plaster? Or wait, what if we did this differently and made this like handmade trowel of this texture? And I am, from a design standpoint, I always love seeing what's going to be the next thing. I don't like doing what's popular. I have my hood vent in my kitchen and it hasn't been done yet because every time we're going to plaster it, all of a sudden that plaster technique becomes popular.
Oh,
and I'm
fun.
like,
And you don't want to look at it.
And I'm like, I don't want to see what everybody else has in their home. I want to see something different. It's, for me, I'm a dreamer and I like to envision new things and what can we do differently. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. We'll have all your contact information in the show notes. You've got a great Instagram. So if you're out there listening, you're going to want to look at Dolo Artisan Finishes. And I'm just looking at some of your videos here. I can't wait to go back and look at them. You've got some great reels and watch Alan and you and work. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your time and coming on.
Yeah.
And that's all till next week.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Curious Builder podcast. If you like what you listen to, please give us a 5-star rating and write us a review. It really means a lot. It's a great way for us to just understand what you like about the podcast and what we can keep doing. So you can review and please share with your friends and family. Find out more at curiousbuilderpodcast.com.